The field of psychology is the most irreproducible field in science. When I heard about the reproducibility crisis in science, I thought that there was no way that, most studies are irreproducible. When it comes to psychology, the grand majority of them are not able to be reproduced. And reproducibility is a cornerstone of the scientific method and science in general. We should be able to repeat experiments and get the same results over and over again to validate our empirical methods used. Now, of course, the reproducibility crisis is not solely attributed to the field of psychology. The second most irreproducible field is medical research, but we'll save that for another video. One of the things about psychology, which is one of the reasons why I think that it is very difficult to use empirical methods to validate our theories, is because of the isolation of variables. It's very difficult to isolate variables in psychology and account for all variables for that matter. Any scientific experiment done in the field of psychology is going to have a lot of trouble being reproduced. The outliers, there will always be outliers that cannot be accounted for using the methods because the variables of human behavior cannot be accounted for. Empirical methods are ill-suited for understanding human action because human behavior is completely dependent on constantly changing and subjective factors. And it is these subjective factors that I'm talking about that cannot be isolated and accounted for. This is where the variation comes into play. One's belief systems, their worldview, things of this nature is going to affect the data. This is why in psychology they're pushing this idea that we need to separate studies culturally and we need to have diversity because people from different cultures raised up in different ways with different value systems psychologically are going to have different value and belief systems, and that's going to reflect in the data. Now, of course, here we could turn to the great Ludwig von Mises, and this man, of course, was an Austrian economist and did some amazing work in the field studying human action. Mises proposed many logical axioms that don't need empirical experiments or a posteriori, observations to understand them. The idea that humans act purposefully to achieve goals. These goals are obviously dependent on the individual. What is a goal for me is not necessarily a goal for you, right? What is a value for you is not necessarily a value for me. Many of these axioms that Mises proposed are geared towards economics. But economics, of course, is completely based on human behavior and human psychology. So we could see a lot of resemblance here in what we could propose as, psychological axioms, fundamentally. Even the idea that humans engage in trade because they expect to benefit. This is, of course, has lots to do with economics. But again, that's fundamentally one of these deep-seated social behaviors in human beings. It's one of the things that differ us from animals, something we've been doing for a very long time, trading. So we will be discussing the praxeological principles moving forward a little bit more, trying to get a better understanding of what these Austrians had in mind, because of course they worked from fundamental axioms and starting points in which we can move towards purposeful conclusions, logical deductions to move towards conclusions that are absolutely sound and universal, versus having empirical statements and conclusions and inductions to try and prove our theories right or wrong. This seems to sort of muddy the water. So if you think about it, most of these psychological theories that have been proposed, and really the popular ones that have stood the test of time, are the ones that were a priori, right? There was no experiment needed to understand them whatsoever. Like the social learning theory. It's like, who needs an experiment to prove that, humans learn socially? It's sort of an absurd thing to propose that, one would counteract that. Think about things like attachment theory. What sort of experiments can be done to prove this correct? Let's think of the experiment of Pavlov's dogs, right? You attach a negative stimulus to, a neutral stimulus. That neutral stimulus is then going to have a negative connotation in the minds of the individual or the animal being you're associating it with. Same with positive, right? So positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, things like this. It's like kind of absurd that we think that we need a study to prove this. Now, apparently, obviously many people used to be more violent with their children and family and things of this nature, but again, it's not like we need an experiment to figure out these sort of a priori truths. Another one is like the hierarchy of needs. Again, many of these things have been thought up a priori before any experiments have been conducted. If you think about it, the best literature that has ever come through in psychology has been around for a very long time, and has all been a priori. If you think of the Stoics, right, they were giving very fundamental axioms, ways of life, ways to live by, things of this nature. Religious texts, again, a priori, based on a true understanding of being. You have people like Kant and Descartes, and even going back to the original psychoanalysts like Jung and Freud and Adler and all these individuals. Perhaps they ran some experiments, but I think fundamentally most of the information that they had was coming a priori. So of course, using the empirical methods, we've started to confuse ourselves because with the materialistic framework, we have this whole nonsense portion of the history of psychology and psychiatry, where we tried to reduce everything biologically, and we tried to tell people that there was some sort of chemical imbalance at the basis, at the root of our problems. Of course, this has been disproven, and it never was proven in the first place. So now one of the biggest problems in psychology research is this connection to our genes, right? The genetics component of it. And of course, this is another absurd part of empiricism that's bleeding into psychology. The idea that, our genes can somehow control our behaviors. It's sort of a scapegoat, and it's sort of allowing us to evade responsibility, right? We could just say, oh, well, I'm the way I am because of my genes. We have the power to shift. We have the power to become who we are. And so there are better fields coming out, like epigenetics and stuff like that, that are moving away from this idea that we are victims to our genetics. But the reality of the situation is that empiricism is the one perpetuating these nonsense, corrosive, unhelpful theories. I have a huge problem with twin studies. There's massive confounding variables here, and we could try and reduce it and boil it down to genetics, but again, it's just, there's no actual empirical data to back any of this up, and logically it just doesn't hold up, so we got to move away from it. So you may be thinking, what about neuroscience? Is that not the field of psychology? I think when it comes to neural anatomy, obviously when we get down into the depths of neuroscience, we've confused ourselves at the idea of a synapse. Dr. Harold Hillman did some amazing work in this area where, he showed that the only evidence that we have for a synapse, which if you think about it logically would be a very inefficient way to, transport electricity, energy, whatever you want to say, if you want to reduce our thoughts to neural networks, it would be very inefficient to have these little gaps, right? And the only evidence for that is electron microscopy, which we know is an empirically invalidated method, because you cannot control for the methods used, so you can't actually confirm the process. But even things like polyvagal theory, again, is not something I would say is a sound theory whatsoever. We're actually going to have a guest on, Dr. Joseph Ledoux, to come on and talk about this, that it might not be this development and evolution of the autonomic nervous system that dictates these fears and emotions and these responses. So, through empiricism, again, we're confusing ourselves in psychology. Now, I harp a lot on empiricism, of course, but I should say many people are not able to rely solely on a rationalism point of view. And not to say that even rationalism is devoid of observation or, sensory experience, because often, a lot of the deductions rely on fundamental starting points in which we observe in nature. But when it comes to empiricism, it's after the matter, right? So we can create our theories, and after the matter, we can test them. And in the way that the world works, we need empirical methods to try to validate the data. The problem is that we don't use empiricism properly, because it's an impossible thing to use properly. It is impossible to fully validate or to fully falsify theories. The reality of the situation is that there will always be outliers, and especially in the field of psychology. Let's take one more experiment, the Stanford prison experiments. You know, if you run this group, take 30 different groups, people with different cultures, different demographics, different backgrounds, all of this different stuff. You could change a bunch of variables. You're going to have different results in every situation. Not to say that, you know, the observation is absurd, because we can certainly observe the results of this, you know, people getting into a position of power and then abusing it. We could observe that. Anybody that lived in monarchical times would have told you this, right? They would have told you this theory a priori, based on solely just an observation, without the need of some sort of a posteriori experimentation to prove it. But if you ran this, say, with, you know, 30 Muslims, I'm sure you wouldn't get the same results, right? Or even 30 people of any religious identity, right? They would likely take care of one another. But say you did half of one religion, half of the other, you'd have, you know, same thing. Or try mixing it with race, or all the same race, and things like this. These are variables that matter, and it's based completely on the value systems and the beliefs, the subjective beliefs of the individual. You could just get a good cohort of individuals who value freedom and, you know, autonomy, sovereignty more than anything else, right? And so they would take care of the inmates as though they were an inmate, right? So when it comes down to it, I think here we're going to focus on the fundamental psychological axioms that we can deduce logically, things that are universal in nature. We're going to learn a lot from the praxeologists, from the Austrian economists. I think that's going to be a great starting point for us. So I'm going to go and gather many of these universal truths and see if we can't work from them, because I know a lot of work has been done in this field to ensure that these are logically validated axioms. Alright, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Make sure to subscribe. We hit 1,000 subscribers, so in the comments below I'm going to leave one of your names down there, and that name is going to be the winner of the book giveaway. You shoot me a message on Instagram or send me an email to claim that book, and I'll get it sent out to you. The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. We may as well give another one at, let's do 2,500 this time. 2,500 subscribers, I'll give away another book. We'll figure out which one it's going to be. Maybe you guys can tell me. We might have to give away Human Action by Ludwig von Mises. That might be a good one. Alright guys, make sure to comment, subscribe, like, and do all that good stuff to help support the channel. Really appreciate you guys for taking the time, checking out this video today. Hope you guys have a good one. Take care.